I had lived in that narrow, aging house for years before anything truly unsettling happened. The place leaned slightly to one side, as though tired of holding itself upright, but I never minded. Old houses have a certain honesty. They creak, they sigh, and they never pretend to be anything other than what they are. My days were predictable, quiet, and unremarkable, exactly how I preferred them. But everything changed the day the old man moved into the apartment across the hall. He arrived with 3 worn-out boxes stacked in his arms, a small lamp with a dim yellow shade, and shoes that tapped against the floor like hesitant warnings. He was old, so old that each movement looked like it cost him effort he could barely afford. His hands trembled when he folded his newspapers, and the way he adjusted his glasses suggested he had done the same gesture thousands of times before. His voice was gentle and polite, a soft covering placed carefully over the fragile and exhausted person beneath it. I appreciated that politeness. It created distance. It kept a kind of quietness in the space between us that suited me perfectly. But there was something about him, something I noticed the very first time he lifted his face toward me. His left eye was cloudy, pale, almost film-like, as though a layer of dead moonlight had settled across its surface. It wasn't blind, yet it didn't seem fully alive either. Whenever it turned toward me, even unintentionally, a cold pressure formed at the back of my neck. The sensation wasn't pain and it wasn't fear. It was a strange, heavy awareness, like being watched by something that didn't blink or breathe the way living things normally do. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than age, a simple condition of his failing sight, but the thought refused to settle. It clung to me like dust in the corners of the house. For a while, I avoided looking directly at it. I reminded myself that he was harmless, kind even. But the eye had a presence of its own, a weight that filled the hallway even when he wasn't standing there. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it insisted on existing inside my mind. Soon I found myself altering the way I walked through the building, keeping my head down, rushing past his door, choosing the stairs at times when I knew he might be leaving his apartment. Still, the feeling persisted. A quiet, constant pressure, as though his eye remained open somewhere in the building, following the shape of my movements through the walls. At night, the house began to feel different. Shadows stretched longer than the lamps allowed, and certain corners felt dense with a presence I couldn't name. I wasn't sure if the change was in the house or in myself. But something had shifted. I lay awake listening to the soft creaking of the wood, and the sound carried a strange new rhythm. It reminded me of breathing, not mine, not his, but a slow, steady pull of air through invisible rooms. This was only the beginning, yet it felt like the end of something I had never understood until now. The old man had moved in. Yes. But the thing that disturbed me most wasn't his age or his quietness. It was the eye, the way it lingered in my mind long after I'd turned away, as though it belonged not to him, but to something using him as a doorway. The more days passed, the more that eye settled into the back of my thoughts like a stain that refused to fade. Even when I didn't see it, I felt it, as though the very memory of it had learned how to breathe beside me. I tried to convince myself that the discomfort was temporary, that my imagination was exaggerating what was nothing more than an old man's unfortunate affliction. But the mind has a cruel habit of noticing what the body tries to ignore. Each time I stepped into the hallway, I felt a subtle tightening in the air,
like the house itself paused to observe my movements. Eventually, I became acutely aware of even the smallest noises coming from his apartment: the soft scrape of a chair leg, the slow rustle of turning pages, the faint sound of a lamp being switched on. Every one of these sounds threaded itself into my nightly routine until they became something I involuntarily listened for. When the hallway grew quiet, when I heard nothing at all, that silence felt heavier than sound. I would lie awake wondering if he was still, if he was awake, or, worst of all, if the pale eye was open in the dark, staring at something only it could see. My sleep began to thin, turning fragile, easily broken by the slightest creak of the old house. More than once I woke abruptly with the sensation of being watched, though my room was empty, and the windows showed nothing but the dull reflection of the streetlight. Yet the fear always pointed in the same direction, toward the hallway, toward the old man's apartment, toward the eye that seemed to exist even when closed behind a door. I didn't intend to check on him, not at first, but I found myself standing outside his door on more nights than I could explain. Perhaps I told myself I was making sure he was all right, that living alone at his age might be dangerous and someone should look out for him. But deep down I knew better. I was not there out of concern. I was there out of compulsion. Standing in that dim hallway, I could hear him breathing through the thin wood of his door. It was a steady, fragile breath, the kind that spoke of long, weary years. But sometimes beneath it, I heard something else, an irregular thump, faint but undeniable, like the echo of a heartbeat muffled by distance. It didn't match the rhythm of his breathing. It didn't match any rhythm I recognized, and each time I heard it, the hair on my arms rose as though touched by something unseen. I stayed longer at his door each night, listening, waiting, trying to understand the strange pull that kept bringing me back. The house felt different during those moments. The hallway seemed to narrow around me as though the walls shifted subtly closer, enclosing me in a space too tight for comfort. I felt as though the house was holding its breath along with me, waiting for something to reveal itself. Eventually, curiosity overcame hesitation. One night, with my hand resting against the rough wooden door, I leaned in just far enough to hear him more clearly. His breathing was normal, steady, unchanged. But as I shifted my weight slightly, the floorboard beneath me let out a soft, betraying groan. The breathing inside the room stopped completely. The sudden absence of sound chilled me more than any noise could have. I waited, motionless, barely daring to breathe myself, but the silence inside persisted, stretching longer with each second until it felt suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a faint movement, just a slight controlled shift, as though someone had opened their eyes without stirring their body. I stepped away from the door at once, my pulse pounding in my throat. I didn't run, but my retreat was quick, almost frantic, as I slipped back into my own apartment and closed the door behind me. Even with the door shut, I felt the weight of something on the other side of the wall, an awareness, a presence, a silent acknowledgement of my watching. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something had changed. Before, I had been the one watching him. Now, I wasn't sure who was watching whom.
The night after he noticed me outside his door, I told myself I would stay inside my apartment and ignore whatever unease lingered in the hallway. I tried to drown the thoughts with ordinary routines, making tea, tidying the table, flicking through channels on the old television. But nothing held my attention. Every sound from the hall, even the whisper of settling wood, drew my focus as sharply as a sudden touch on the shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was waiting for me, not with impatience, but with certainty. It was as though the house itself understood that I would step into the hallway again, no matter how much I resisted. When the clock in the living room reached midnight, a soft ringing echoed through the walls, reminding me that time had moved without my permission. Midnight felt like the hour when the building shed its daytime disguise and showed what it truly was beneath the layers of paint and wood. I stood from the couch, my body acting before my mind agreed, and found myself once again opening my apartment door. The hallway was dark except for the faint, washed-out glow of the emergency light at the far end. The air was cooler there, unmoving, carrying the faint scent of dust and old paper. I walked slowly, more softly than I intended, the floorboards creaking faintly under my weight. Each sound felt sharper in the stillness, as though the hallway amplified my presence. The old man's door was closed, but it felt alive, as if the wood held a breath behind it. Without meaning to, I found myself drawn toward it again. The familiarity of this strange ritual frightened me. Habit is one thing, but obsession is another, and I could no longer deny which one I had fallen into. As I reached his door, I paused, listening. His breathing was faint, but steady, the soft rhythm of an old man in deep sleep. That might have comforted me once, but now I focused on something else entirely, the quiet pause between each breath. In those brief moments, I felt as if the entire hallway leaned closer, listening alongside me. There was a strange expectancy in the air, as though something waited for a mistake, a slip, a sound, anything to break the stillness. Then I heard it again, that faint thump, the irregular heartbeat-like sound hidden beneath the quiet. It didn't seem to come from his chest. It didn't seem to come from anywhere logical. It pulsed like something buried under the floor, beating through layers of wood and memory. I bent slightly closer to the door, trying to catch the rhythm, but as I leaned in, the sound shifted, almost as if it recognized my presence. It grew sharper, more deliberate, as though answering my curiosity with its own. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back from the door, trying to calm my breathing, but the silence in the hallway made my own breath sound too loud, too intrusive. For a moment, I felt the unmistakable sensation that something inside the old man's room was awake and aware. Not him, but something else, something watching the door from the other side. I told myself to leave. I told myself to walk back to my apartment and shut the door and never approach his room again. Yet my body refused to move. The hallway felt heavier now, as if invisible hands pressed gently against my shoulders, urging me to stay. I wasn't trapped physically, I knew that, but something deeper held me there, something that made turning away feel dangerous. When I finally forced myself to take a step back, the floorboard beneath my foot let out a long, drawn-out creak. It was an ordinary sound, but in that moment it felt like a signal, a warning, or perhaps an announcement. The old man's door was closed, but it was suddenly enveloped in a strange tension. I knew that a stirring would come now or later. I couldn't shake the unease that my presence was known. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were trembling. I closed the door gently, not wanting to alert him further, but once it clicked shut, the weight of what had just happened pressed hard on my shoulders. This was no longer curiosity. It was no longer unease. It had grown into a connection, unwanted, unnatural, and impossible to sever. That night, as I lay in my dark room unable to sleep, I realized the truth I had ignored for far too long. I was no longer watching him out of fear or fascination. I was watching because something about him, something behind that pale, lifeless eye, was watching me first.
The next morning arrived with a heaviness I couldn't shake. Even the sunlight looked different, filtered through a haze that made the air seem thicker than usual. I tried to convince myself that the events of the previous night were nothing more than nerves, a trick of a tired mind. But every thought led back to the same memory. The way his breathing changed the moment the floorboard creaked beneath me. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't imagination. He had known I was there.
For the rest of the day, I moved through my routine mechanically, as though someone had taken over the basic functions of my body while my mind drifted elsewhere. I avoided the hallway, choosing instead to stay inside where the faint hum of appliances and the familiar texture of my walls gave me enough comfort to feel anchored, even if slightly. Still, I couldn't escape the feeling that the old man's presence stretched further than the boundaries of his apartment. The building felt different now, as if his awareness had seeped through the gaps in the walls, filling the empty spaces between the rooms. By evening, my nerves were stretched thin. The sun sank behind the neighboring buildings, and though I tried to distract myself, the quiet hours before nightfall felt more ominous than any darkness. Dusk has a way of blurring certainty, and in that blurred space, my thoughts began circling the same unavoidable truth. I would end up in the hallway again. It no longer felt like choice. It felt like inevitability. When night finally arrived, I waited longer than usual before leaving my apartment. The silence outside felt heavier than the night before, as if the building had stopped breathing altogether. I opened my door slowly, letting the dim hallway come into view inch by inch. The emergency light flickered once, casting a weak glow across the peeling paint and the warped floorboards. Nothing moved, yet everything felt awake. I walked toward his door, each step quiet but impossible to hide. The hallway's narrowness made it feel like I was walking into a throat, and the darkness behind me felt too close, too attentive. When I reached his door, I paused, listening for the familiar rhythm of his breathing. At first, I heard nothing, and the silence pressed against my ears until I wondered whether the door itself was listening for me. Then, slowly, the faint sound of breath slipped through the wood. Calm, even, unmistakably the breath of someone asleep. Relief settled into me, though it was shallow and fragile. I hesitated only a moment before leaning slightly closer, just enough to hear the quiet details of the room within. His breathing filled the space with a kind of fragile peace, but beneath it, I sensed something else, a stillness that wasn't natural. It reminded me of the pause between a question and an answer, a moment suspended in expectation. As I listened, the soft rustle of movement whispered from inside. His breathing lingered on the edge of wakefulness, and then, almost too softly to notice, it shifted. The rhythm changed again, just as it had the night before. Each breath became slower, heavier, as though he were aware of something near him.
I stiffened, but before I could step back, another sound cut through the stillness. His bed creaked, not from the restless shifting of a sleeping man, but from a controlled movement, deliberate and slow. It was the kind of movement someone makes when they are aware of being observed. My heart stuttered. A cold, tingling sensation spread across my spine. I took a slow step backward, barely breathing as the bed inside creaked again, responding to his shift in position. The air felt sharp, like it had grown teeth. I didn't move another inch, afraid even the softest exhale might betray me. Then everything inside the room fell silent. The quiet stretched so long that I felt my pulse beating in my throat. I almost convinced myself to leave, to turn around and retreat to my apartment before something worse happened. But before I could take a second step, a faint click sounded from behind the door. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The soft, brittle crack of an eyelid opening. Not both, just one. The eye. I didn't see it, but I felt it.
It opened onto the darkness, not at me, but toward the space where I stood, as though the air itself told it my exact position. A wave of cold washed over me, the kind that rises from the deepest part of the body. The hallway felt too narrow, too intimate, as though the distance between us had evaporated. I backed away again, more quickly this time, and the moment my foot touched the creaky floorboard, the breathing inside the room changed sharply. It became fast, shallow, irregular, nothing like the peaceful rhythm from minutes before. It was the breathing of someone who was now fully awake, someone who knew they were not alone. I turned and walked quickly back to my apartment, shutting the door behind me with a quiet but urgent finality. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to steady myself against the wall. The silence of my apartment offered no comfort now. In the dark reflection of my window, I saw only the memory of that eye, open somewhere in the building, searching in the dark, waiting for the next sound that would tell it where I was. As I lay down that night, unable to close my own eyes, I understood something deeply and undeniably. I had crossed a line. Whatever existed between me and that eye was no longer a matter of curiosity or fear. It had become connection, and connections like this do not break easily. They pull, they follow, they open wider in the dark. The eye was awake now, and it was waiting for me to return.
Sleep abandoned me entirely after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though the darkness behind my eyelids wasn't empty, but occupied. Occupied by the memory of that single cloudy eye opening in a room I could not see but could somehow feel. I tossed in bed until the sheets twisted around my legs, trapping me in the restless movements of my own fear. Even when dawn came, its light seemed thin and useless, unable to fade the sensation that something in the building had awakened alongside the old man. The house felt different now. It felt attentive. When I stepped into the hallway the next morning, the air smelled faintly of something stale and metallic, as though the walls themselves were breathing in a way they hadn't before. I walked past his door without looking at it, but I felt a faint pressure, like the weight of a gaze, push between my shoulder blades. The sensation lingered until I reached the stairwell, and even as I descended to the ground floor, I knew it wasn't imagination. The house had begun to recognize me. Each footstep I took seemed echoed not by the building, but by something within it. Throughout the day, I tried distracting myself with the outside world, but nothing felt real beyond the walls of that hallway. I moved through shops and streets like a ghost, my mind circling the same unsettling thought. If the eye could sense me through a door, what else might it know? What else might it seek? When I finally returned home, evening had already smothered the sky, and the building's entrance felt darker than usual, as though the shadows had thickened while I was gone. Opening my apartment door felt like stepping into a waiting mouth. The air was heavy, stale, almost expectant. Even though my room was empty, I sensed a shift in the stillness, a difference so subtle yet so absolute that I paused just inside the doorway to make sure nothing had physically changed. Everything looked the same, yet I felt watched, not from within my apartment, but through the walls around me, like faint whispers of movement existed just beyond the edges of perception. I tried to stay inside that night. Truly, I tried. I turned on the television for background noise, but the voices felt distant and hollow, more like echoes trapped inside glass than anything comforting. I made tea, but the warmth in my hands failed to calm the tremor in my fingers. I walked from one room to another, but every step I took seemed to draw quiet attention from something unseen. The atmosphere had shifted enough that simply being inside my own apartment felt wrong, as though the floor beneath me shared its knowledge of where I had been the previous night. By the time the clock neared midnight, my nervous pacing had turned into a ritual all its own. My mind kept pulling me toward the hallway, and each attempt to resist only strengthened that pull. Finally, when the minute hand struck 12, A soft, settling sound came from somewhere deep in the building, a sound so faint and so deliberate that it felt like the house had exhaled. The noise slid beneath my consciousness and erased the last barrier of hesitation. I opened my door. The hallway was cold, colder than it should have been, as if every bit of warmth had been drained away since the previous night. The light flickered above me, dimming for a heartbeat longer than usual before returning with a pale, sickly glow. I stepped out, my breath faintly visible in the air, something that never happened inside the building. My footsteps sounded sharper than they should have been, as though the floorboards beneath me had grown thinner, eager to announce each movement I made. I didn't want to go to his door, yet every step I took aligned me with the invisible path I had created through repetition. It felt like the hallway guided me forward, nudging me closer, training me the same way a house trains the creaks and groans of its aging body. The more I walked, the more I convinced that the building itself had learned my footsteps, memorized them, welcomed them, perhaps even anticipated them. When I finally reached his door, the air around it felt colder than the rest of the hallway. I listened for his breathing, expecting the steady rhythm of sleep, but the silence behind the door was complete, a silence so deep and unnatural that it pressed at my ears. For a moment, I thought perhaps he wasn't there at all. But then, faintly, a soft sound emerged. Not breathing, not movement, something slower. A pulse. A single, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat echoing through walls that should have been silent. The sound grew clearer the longer I listened, though it did not grow louder. It sounded as though it came from every inch of the room at once, from the floorboards, from the walls, from the very air behind the door. I felt a chill spread across my skin as I realized something that tightened my chest with dread. The pulse was matching my heartbeat. Not perfectly, but close enough to feel like a response. The moment I recognized the pattern, the pace changed, shifting subtly to meet mine. Whether it was imitation or connection, I couldn't tell. But the awareness of it, of something inside that room adjusting itself to my presence, froze me where I stood. I slowly reached out my hand, not touching the door, but holding it a few inches away. And as my fingers hovered in the cold air, the pulse inside shifted again. It became faster, as if excited, or waiting. My hand trembled. I pulled it back, and in that exact moment, the pulse stopped. Completely. The sudden absence of sound felt violent, as though something inside the room had just stepped closer to the door, holding its breath the same way I was holding mine. I backed away slowly, each movement measured, but the silence followed me, like a shadow pressed against my spine. When I finally reached my apartment, I stepped inside and shut the door, leaning against it as my pulse hammered through my fingertips. I stayed there for minutes, maybe longer, listening for any sound from the hallway, but none came. Eventually, I understood something profoundly unsettling. I was no longer just observing him. I was drawing him out. My presence had become part of the ritual. And rituals have a way of deepening. They never stay small. They grow.
The next day felt strangely muted, as though the world outside the building had thinned into something distant and unimportant. I tried stepping out for fresh air, but even the sunlight seemed pale, dimmed by the weight of what waited inside the walls. And while people passed me on the street, talking, laughing, living, I felt detached from them, as if a pane of old glass separated my reality from theirs. Every sound in the outside world felt faint compared to the memory of that pulsing rhythm I had heard through the old man's door. And my heartbeat hadn't slowed since. It was as though the echo of that pulse had lodged itself inside my chest, syncing with me in ways I didn't understand. I returned to the building earlier than usual, compelled by a restlessness I couldn't suppress. And the moment I stepped inside,
A familiar coldness wrapped around me. The hallway lights flickered once and steadied, just enough to make my skin tense, and I walked slowly to my apartment, each step carrying the subtle sense that I was not entering the building, I was returning to something that had been waiting. For hours I paced inside my apartment, listening to the faint groans of the old structure, trying to focus on anything else, but the house made its presence known in small, deliberate ways: a soft creak near the corner of the living room, a faint tap along the wall, a barely there vibration under the floor. None of these sounds had bothered me before, yet now they felt intentionally placed, as if someone or something was testing my awareness. By the time night settled in, I understood that resisting the hallway was pointless. The house felt too alive, too attentive, as though my attempts to ignore it only deepened its curiosity. Midnight came with a gentle hum that traveled through the walls, a signal felt rather than heard, and once again I opened my apartment door. The hallway was darker than usual, the emergency light flickering with a weak, strained glow that barely illuminated the space, and a pocket of cold air drifted down the corridor, brushing against my skin like a deliberate touch. The old man's door stood closed as always, yet the quiet surrounding it felt charged, like static before a storm, and I approached, not quickly, but with a quiet inevitability, each step echoing faintly. When I reached the door, I paused to listen, expecting the breathing or the pulse from the night before, but what I heard was worse. Nothing. No breathing, no shifting, no faint pulse embedded in the walls, only silence, a deep and complete silence that felt unnatural. I leaned in slightly, holding my breath, waiting for some sign of life, and after a long moment of perfect stillness, something stirred inside the room. It was soft, almost too soft to catch, like the delicate slide of fabric across a smooth surface. And the sound stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a thin trail of dread that crawled up my spine. Still, no breathing came. The silence pressed tighter, stretching until the air itself felt strained, and I told myself to return to my apartment before something irreversible happened. But before I could step back, a faint movement occurred, something shifting close to the floor inside the room, slow and fluid, as though it had no weight. The sound drifted toward the door, and my pulse quickened with painful force. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sigh, like the whisper of an eyelid dragging open after a long, heavy sleep. Except the sound was not at bed height. It came from near the floor. My breath froze. Whatever was on the other side of that door was not standing, not lying in bed, not moving in any human way. It felt wrong in shape, wrong in intention, wrong in everything that makes a person human. And then, clearer than anything before, another sound slipped beneath the door. A slow exhale, not the old man's voice, not any voice. A sound too deliberate, too conscious, too aware. I felt the weight of a gaze settle on me, not seen, but unmistakably felt. The gaze of something that observed, not with curiosity, but with recognition. I didn't see the eye, but the sense of it was overwhelming. It stared with a kind of hunger, not for harm, but for acknowledgement, as though the act of being noticed completed it. My knees weakened under the pressure of its attention. I stepped backward, but even as I moved away, the sensation intensified. It wasn't watching my retreat, it was following it, tracking every inch I put between us. And as I took another step, a chilling realization crystallized in my mind. The eye was no longer just his.
It no longer belonged to a face. It was becoming something that existed on its own, separate, aware, and no longer confined to the old man's failing body. That night, when I finally returned to my apartment, shaking and barely breathing, I understood that whatever lived behind that door had awakened. Not the old man, but something else, something that had been waiting inside him, using him as a place to rest until it found a new shape, a new direction, a new purpose. And now, for reasons I couldn't comprehend, it had chosen me.
The following morning passed in a haze, the kind that dulls the edges of every thought, yet sharpens the fear hiding between them. I moved through my apartment as though it were unfamiliar territory, every corner seeming to hold a memory from the night before. Nothing had changed physically. The furniture sat where it always had. The windows let in the same gray light, but the air felt altered, heavier, slower, as if every particle held traces of something watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence again. I tried distracting myself with chores, with noises, with anything mundane, but no task could hold my attention for more than a few seconds. My mind drifted back to the door, to the silence beneath it, to the scrape of that impossible sigh. And beneath all of that, deeper and more unnerving, was the memory of recognition. It had recognized me. I could not explain how I knew this, but I felt it with a certainty that made my pulse uneasy. By afternoon, the building seemed quieter than usual. I stepped into the hallway briefly to collect the mail, and the moment my foot touched the floorboards, a faint vibration trembled beneath me. It was subtle, so subtle that I almost dismissed it as imagination, yet it repeated when I took another step. Soft, rhythmic, distant, like the building was breathing in slow, controlled intervals. I paused, listening, but the second I stopped moving, the vibration faded into stillness. I took another cautious step. There it was again, humming faintly through the wood. It wasn't the old man's breathing. It wasn't the pulse I had heard through the door. This felt deeper, as though something beneath the floor had awakened and was stirring for the first time in years. I knelt and pressed my hand against the floor, expecting to feel nothing, yet a subtle warmth radiated upward. Not heat, just warmth, organic, living, pulsing. It seemed to throb faintly beneath my palm, not in a steady rhythm, but in slow, uneven beats, like a creature too weak to move, yet desperate to be acknowledged. The realization sent a cold wave down my spine. Whatever had opened its eye behind the old man's door was no longer confined to that room. It had seeped outward, expanding its reach, spreading through the bones of the building itself. For the rest of the day, every noise became suspect. The tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the distant traffic outside, all of it sounded faintly wrong, overshadowed by the memory of that warm, subtle tremor under the floor. I avoided the hallway, but avoiding it felt unnatural, like ignoring a voice calling your name from another room. As evening approached, the light in my apartment flickered twice, though no storm lingered outside. I stood still, listening, and in that moment the floor shifted again, slightly, but enough for the wood to release a long, low groan that vibrated through my legs. It felt like a warning, or an invitation. Midnight approached, and with it came a certainty I couldn't escape. Whatever lived in this building was no longer curious about me. It was preparing for something, gathering itself, testing the limits of its presence. And whether I wanted to or not, I was already part of its design.
I stood frozen,
my back pressed against the inside of the door, listening as the slow, dragging outside crept closer, moving with the measured insistence of something that didn't need speed to reach its prey. The sound was soft, but its softness made it worse because it carried intention, like fingertips testing the grain of the floor, learning the texture of the world 1 inch at a time. I held my breath without realizing it, afraid even the faint rhythm of my lungs might draw it nearer. For a moment, the dragging paused directly in front of my door, and the silence it left behind felt like a living thing, expanding and contracting against the wood as though it were breathing through the frame. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but run where? The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls too close, the air too thin, as if the space itself was shrinking in anticipation of what waited outside. I reached for the lock with trembling fingers, but before I could slide it into place, the door shifted, just a fraction, pushed not by force, but by presence, a subtle inward bulge that made the wood groan softly under the pressure. I snatched my hand away from the lock, terrified the sound of metal scraping might provoke it. The bulge faded slowly, like the door had inhaled and then exhaled, returning to stillness. The thing outside wasn't trying to enter, not yet. It was waiting, listening, learning the outline of my fear as though fear itself were a language it was beginning to understand. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had lost its edges, and then a new sound emerged, one that filled me with a deeper dread than anything I had heard before. It was a faint tapping, not on the floor but higher, right against the surface of the door near my shoulder. The taps were slow and spaced out, each one carrying the weight of deliberate thought, as if it were testing different points along the door to understand how thick the wood was, how solid, how strong. I backed away in small steps, unable to tear my eyes from the trembling doorknob. The tapping followed me as I retreated, shifting slightly up or down depending on where I moved, tracking me through the barrier as though my location radiated heat. I reached the far corner of my living room and pressed myself against the wall, but distance didn't bring safety. The tapping paused, and then, impossibly, came again, this time lower, closer to the floor, aligned with where my feet would have been had I stayed by the door. It was mimicking positions, mapping my movements, learning me. A sudden creak jolted through the wood, snapping me back into motion. I stumbled toward the bedroom, slamming its door shut and locking it, though I knew locks meant nothing to something that didn't push or break, but seeped and learned. In the darkness of my bedroom, I stood shaking, listening to the apartment stretch with quiet sounds of age that no longer felt like age at all. Then, just as I dared to hope the hallway had reclaimed whatever crawled there, a new sound slipped beneath the crack of the bedroom door. A whisper, thin yet unmistakably alive, shaping not a word, but a breath meant only for me. It knew exactly where I was.
For several heartbeats, I couldn't move. My body refused to obey the simplest commands, as if it understood something my mind hadn't fully accepted. Stepping forward meant seeing what had stepped out, and stepping back meant turning my back on it. Both options felt equally dangerous. The scrape I had heard from inside the old man's room still echoed faintly in my ears, each repetition in my memory making it sound more deliberate, more purposeful. I stared into the thin slice of darkness between the door and the frame, expecting a shape to emerge, but nothing visible moved there, and somehow that absence terrified me even more. Darkness that hides nothing is comforting. Darkness that hides because it chooses to is unbearable. I forced myself to breathe slowly as the air in the hallway grew colder, not in a natural way, but in a way that felt as if something was siphoning the warmth directly from my skin. The cold pressed against my bones, seeping deeper with each second. I stepped back once, my heel touching the threshold of my apartment, and the moment I moved, the darkness inside the old man's room seemed to shift. Not outward, not forward, just a subtle internal rearrangement, like a creature adjusting its posture in response to sound. The scrape followed a moment later, this time softer, like fingertips brushing lightly across wood. A terrible realization dawned on me then. Whatever had stepped across the threshold hadn't done so standing upright. The sound was too low, too close to the ground. It crawled the way a memory crawls into the back of the mind and refuses to leave. The image alone made my stomach twist. My breathing grew shallow as a faint shape began to form just beyond the door, a contour barely distinguishable from the dark, as though the shadows themselves were thickening. It wasn't a body, not fully, more like an outline, an impression of something trying to learn or imitate the idea of shape. The air quivered slightly, as if the presence itself vibrated at a frequency too low to hear, but strong enough to feel. Then, without warning, a low creak sounded along the hallway floor, not from where the door stood, but from halfway between it and me. Something had moved across the boards without me noticing, silent until it chose not to be. I fought the instinct to slam my door shut and bolt the lock, knowing that making noise might provoke something I didn't understand. Instead, I stepped back 1 inch at a time, keeping my eyes fixed on the place where the creak had come from, searching for a shape I could anchor my fear to. But nothing solid appeared. Only the cold deepened, wrapping around me like a slow tightening rope. And then the faintest breath brushed against my ankle, warm, close, impossibly near. I jerked backward, stumbling into my apartment, heart pounding so violently that it drowned out every thought. I pulled the door closed with shaking hands, not daring to lock it yet, listening for sounds in the hallway. For a moment, the silence returned, thick and suffocating, and I almost convinced myself that the breath on my skin had been imagination. But then the sound came. Not a scrape, not a whisper. A soft, slow dragging, moving from the hallway toward my door. It had followed me. The whisper did not return for the rest of the day, but the silence it left behind was far worse. It pressed against my apartment like a thick fog, settling in the corners, filling the cracks, clinging to the air as though sound itself had become afraid to exist. I tried staying busy, tried pretending that the voice calling my name through the wall hadn't drained all warmth from the building, but every small sound, a shifting floorboard, a distant elevator thud, even the hum of the refrigerator felt like it carried a message beneath it, something coded and deliberate that I wasn't meant to understand yet. By evening, the air tasted metallic, as if the building had exhaled dust from some forgotten cavity in its structure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed permanently after the voice spoke. I no longer felt watched only from the old man's apartment. I felt watched from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the space behind the pipes. It was as though the entire building had grown one enormous unseen eye, and it was fixed solely on me. I waited as long as I could before stepping into the hallway, hoping midnight wouldn't draw me out the way it had the previous nights. But when the clock approached that cursed hour, a soft tremor shivered through the floor beneath my feet, traveling up my legs like a cold ripple of anticipation. I stood, frozen, listening. The tremor repeated, gentle, rhythmic, coaxing. It felt like footsteps, distant but drawing closer through the bones of the building. Not human footsteps. Too smooth, too evenly spaced, too quiet to belong to anything with weight. The realization settled into my chest with a heavy dread. Something was moving. Not inside the old man's room. Outside it. In the hallway. I opened my apartment door with trembling hands, hoping desperately that I was mistaken, that I would find an empty corridor awaiting me. But the moment the door cracked open, a cold rush of air swept past me, and the lights flickered violently before stabilizing at half strength. The hallway looked unchanged, yet it felt occupied in a way that stole the breath from my lungs. I stepped slowly, every instinct screaming to retreat. I forced myself to look toward the old man's door, expecting it to remain closed like every night before. Instead, my blood ran cold. The door was open, not wide, not enough to see inside, but open just enough to reveal darkness so deep it looked like a hole in the world. The breath left my body in a sharp, silent gasp. The old man could not have opened it. He had not moved, not spoken, not breathed normally for days. Something else had opened that door. Something that had learned to sigh against the floor, to echo my heartbeat, to whisper my name. I stood, rooted in place, unable to step forward or back, as a soft scrape came from within the room, like fingernails tracing along the floor. Then a second sound followed, one that told me everything had changed forever. A single, deliberate step crossing the threshold. Whatever had lived behind that door had finally decided to come out.
The next morning brought a gray, stale light that seeped through my curtains like the diluted remnants of daylight rather than the real thing. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, unable to shake the memory of the door subtly expanding as though it had drawn breath from the darkness behind it. I knew what I had witnessed wasn't a trick of exhaustion. Exhaustion does not bend wood. It does not animate a door. It does not make the air feel aware of your thoughts. Something inside that room had come alive, and it had begun reaching outward, testing the boundaries of its confinement, as though the walls, the floors, and even the old man's body had become too small to contain it. I avoided the hallway all morning, but the walls in my apartment vibrated faintly with subtle sighs and creaks, none of them familiar. Each noise carried a strange cadence, like an echo of something learning how to imitate the world around it. Several times I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to understand whether these sounds were normal. But the moment my skin touched the surface, the vibrations grew warmer. It felt as though the building recognized the contact, responding to me, acknowledging me. That frightened me more than the eye itself. Something was expanding its presence, claiming territory one wall at a time, learning how to move through the structure as a silent tenant. By midday, a soft tapping began on the other side of my living room wall. A steady, patient rhythm, too intentional to be random. I tried ignoring it, but the taps seemed to respond to my movements, slowing when I stopped walking, speeding up when I crossed the room. Eventually, I froze in place, and the tapping stopped completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had. It felt loaded with expectation, as though something waited for me to act. My throat tightened. I took a single step backward, and instantly a new sound emerged. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakable. A thin, strained whisper slipped through the wall, dragging my name across the plaster with the softness of a dying breath. At first, I thought it was the old man calling me, weak and frail, in need of help. But the moment the voice finished shaping my name, a chilling realization hit me. It did not sound like him. His voice had always been gentle, weary, fragile. This whisper carried none of that. It was deeper, stretched, strained, as though something unused to speaking was testing the limits of a borrowed throat. My skin prickled. The whisper came again, this time slower, pressing each syllable into the wall as if feeling its way through the sound. I stepped back, but the voice followed, sliding along the wall as though tracking my exact position, repeating my name with increasing clarity. I covered my ears, but it didn't matter. The whisper wasn't entering through sound. It felt internal, resonating through the bones of the apartment, vibrating through the structure itself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the voice stopped. The silence that followed carried a terrible understanding. The old man hadn't spoken. Whatever had awakened inside his room had learned how to shape a voice, and the first word it chose to speak was mine.
Midnight had become a boundary in the building, a moment when ordinary rules felt suspended, when the quiet between the walls seemed to lean forward and listen. As the clock neared 12, I felt a growing pressure inside my chest, not painful, but heavy, as if my body recognized the hour even before my mind did. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the shadows stretching along the floor, and for a long time I told myself I wouldn't leave the room. I wouldn't open the door. I wouldn't step into the hallway and invite whatever waited there to acknowledge me again. But that resolve dissolved slowly, replaced by a deep, quiet pull I couldn't resist. The same pull that had drawn me night after night to the old man's door. It felt almost like a summons. When the minute hand clicked into place and the clock touched midnight, the lights in my room dimmed. Not out, not fully, but as though something had passed between me and the bulb, a presence too faint for the eye, yet strong enough to disturb the air. My breath stalled. The floor beneath me pulsed, once, then again, a soft throb that matched neither the building's normal settling nor my own heartbeat. It felt like the entire structure exhaled beneath my feet. That was when I knew the hallway was waiting. I opened my door slowly, afraid of what I might find, but more afraid of ignoring it. The hallway stretched out before me in its usual narrow shape, but something was different. The shadows clung to the corners more tightly, refusing to give way to the emergency light. The quiet felt thick enough to touch, as though sound itself had been drained from the air. I stepped outside, and the floorboards responded with a deep, hollow sigh, not from age, but from awareness, as if recognizing my presence. This time, I didn't walk toward the old man's door out of curiosity. I walked because the building guided me. Subtle vibrations under the floor, faint drafts of cold air nudging me forward. The hallway felt alive, breathing slowly around me. When I reached his door, I stopped, but not of my own decision. My feet halted as if compelled, as though crossing a certain invisible line might break something delicate and dangerous. The door looked the same as always: aged wood, peeling varnish, a brass handle worn dull with time, but the sense of stillness behind it was different. It felt less like a closed room and more like a held breath. I leaned in. No breathing, no pulse, no shifting. Only a strange, faint pressure against the door's surface, as though something stood inches away on the other side, mirroring my position. My skin prickled. I listened harder, and after what felt like an eternity, the door expanded slightly, a soft outward bulge, as if it had inhaled. I stepped back instantly, heart pounding. Doors don't breathe. Wood doesn't flex like that unless pushed from within. But I had seen it, just a slight, unsettling movement, subtle enough to deny, but undeniable once witnessed. The house exhaled again, a low vibration passing under my feet, and the door seemed to settle, returning to its stillness. I understood then that whatever lived inside that room wasn't confined anymore. It could reach the door. It could press against it. It could breathe through it. And if it could do that, then soon enough it could choose to open it.